In the tapestry of American history, some names shine brightly in the public imagination: Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, leaders whose courage in the streets became synonymous with the civil rights movement. Yet, long before the marches, the boycotts, and the speeches that electrified a generation, another battle was being fought quietly in the courtroom. That battle was led by Charles Hamilton Houston, a man whose vision, discipline, and legal genius made him the architect of civil rights. Houston understood something profound: that to dismantle segregation, one had to attack its foundation, the legal system that allowed it to stand, while Jim Crow laws enforced separate but equal. In reality, they cemented inequality across schools, workplaces, and public life. Houston refused to accept this hypocrisy. He believed that if the courts could be forced to face the truth, the law itself could become a weapon for justice rather than oppression. Imagine the courage it took to stand against an entire system that was not just biased, but hostile. Every courtroom he entered was a battlefield. Every case was more than paperwork. It was a strike against centuries of injustice. While most of the nation saw segregation as an unshakable fact of life, Houston saw cracks in its legal armor. His strategy was deliberate: expose inequality, case, until even the highest courts could no longer deny it. What makes his story so compelling is not only his brilliance as a lawyer, but also his foresight. Houston trained a generation of young black lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, who would later argue the historic Brown v. Board of Education case, the decision that finally declared segregated schools unconstitutional. Without Houston, there would be no Marshall. Without Houston, the legal pathway to equality might never have been cleared. And yet, unlike the more visible figures of the civil rights movement, Houston's legacy often lingers in the shadows. He did not lead marches with thousands at his back. He did not give speeches to cheering crowds. Instead, he worked long hours in courtrooms, libraries, and classrooms, meticulously building the legal foundation that would one day bring segregation to its knees. His story is a reminder that revolutions are not only fought in the streets, they are also fought with ideas, strategies, and relentless determination behind closed doors. As we journey through this story together, we will uncover how one man's fight in the courtroom paved the way for nationwide change. We will see how a quiet, deliberate struggle against injustice lit the fuse for the explosive social movements that came later. And we will discover why Charles Hamilton Houston remains one of the most important, yet overlooked, figures in American history. If you are ready to learn about the man who helped bring down Jim Crow not with protests, but with the law itself, then stay with us. And before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, do not forget to like this video, share it with others who care about history and justice, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we will keep uncovering the untold stories that shaped our world. Born in 1895 in Washington, into a household where the law and the classroom were not just professions but guiding principles of life, Charles Hamilton Houston was shaped from the very beginning by the quiet determination of his parents. His father, a lawyer who understood the power of words and the precision of legal reasoning, carried himself with a dignity that spoke of resilience in a society that rarely acknowledged the worth of black professionals. His mother, a teacher who believed that education was both a weapon and a shield, instilled in her son the discipline to learn not merely for personal gain but for the uplift of his people. This balance of law and education became the twin pillars of his early world, grounding him in a sense of responsibility that went beyond the ordinary ambitions of a young man. He grew up in Washington at a time when the capital city was segregated, its neighborhoods divided by invisible lines that marked opportunity for some and exclusion for others. But within the walls of his home, The environment was one of encouragement, structure, and quiet resolve. From an early age, Houston's brilliance became evident, and his parents nurtured that gift with the expectation that it was not only his personal strength, but also his duty to cultivate it for the benefit of others. At M Street High School, one of the premier academic institutions for black students in the country, he proved to be more than just a promising student. He stood out as someone who carried an uncommon clarity of thought, a mind sharpened by constant reading, debate, and reflection. His teachers quickly recognized that he was not only absorbing information, but also questioning it, interpreting it, and reshaping it into arguments that revealed both intellect and conviction. In classrooms where excellence was demanded, Houston thrived, developing the rigorous habits of study that would later define his career. His time at M Street was not merely an education, it was an apprenticeship in resilience, where achievement itself was a form of defiance against the limits society tried to impose. When he left Washington for Amherst College, the move represented not only a geographical shift but also a cultural one, placing him in an environment where his abilities would be tested in entirely new ways. Amherst was a world dominated by privilege, but Houston refused to shrink into the background. Instead, he excelled academically, consistently ranking among the top of his class. Not through easy victories but through relentless discipline. His drive was not born of vanity but of a deeper purpose, a conviction that his success could serve as a rebuttal to every assumption of inferiority placed upon his race. At Amherst, his professors took note of his sharp analytical skills and his ability to present arguments with clarity and power, traits that would become hallmarks of his later legal career. He graduated with distinction, his record of academic excellence not just an accomplishment in itself, but a signal of what was to come. What made Houston's path extraordinary was the way his personal story reflected the larger struggles of his time. To be born in Washington, at the turn of the century meant growing up in a city caught between progress and prejudice, where black professionals could carve out respectable lives but still faced barriers at every turn. His father's work as a lawyer gave him an intimate view of how the law could both restrict and liberate, depending on who controlled its interpretation. His mother's role as a teacher taught him that education was the foundation of empowerment, a truth he carried with him through every stage of his life. Together, these influences built in him a sense of mission that went beyond his own achievements. At Amherst, this sense of mission deepened. He was not content merely to succeed for himself. He was learning how knowledge could be wielded as a tool to challenge systems of inequality. Each book he read, each argument he crafted, and each idea he tested against his peers became part of a larger preparation, a sharpening of his intellect for battles he had not yet fought but could already foresee. The contrast between his upbringing in Washington and his experiences in predominantly white academic spaces gave him a dual perspective that would later prove invaluable. He understood both the constraints placed upon his community and the mindset of those who imposed them. This duality allowed him to navigate between worlds, to speak with authority in spaces that often excluded voices like his, and to carry back what he had learned to serve his own people. His story up to this point was not yet the story of a famous lawyer dismantling unjust systems, but it was the essential foundation without which that later work would not have been possible. It was in his family's home, in the halls of M Street High, and in the classrooms of Amherst College that the character of Charles Hamilton Houston was forged. Disciplined, intellectually sharp, and driven by a purpose larger than himself, the young man who emerged from these experiences was not simply a scholar, but a visionary in the making. Someone who had begun to see the outlines of a struggle that would define his life's work. By excelling in environments where few expected him to thrive, he was proving not just his own capability, but the broader truth that excellence had no racial boundary, that talent and perseverance could speak a language more powerful than prejudice. And it was this conviction, born from the influences of his family and his education, that would carry him into the next chapters of his life, where he would transform personal brilliance into a weapon against systemic injustice. When Charles Hamilton Houston entered the military during World War I, he carried with him the promise of education, discipline, and a belief that serving his country would grant him the dignity and respect that every citizen deserved. Yet, the world he encountered in uniform revealed an entirely different reality, one that seared itself into his consciousness and reshaped the trajectory of his life. As one of the very few black officers at the time, he stepped into a position that should have represented honor and authority. But instead it became a daily reminder of the deeply entrenched racial divisions that governed American society. His presence in that role challenged an entire system built on exclusion. And for that, he was met with hostility so severe that he narrowly escaped a violent attack that could have ended his life. That moment was not just an incident of cruelty. It was a brutal lesson about the stakes of inequality and the risks borne by those who dared to rise above the limits society imposed on them. The near lynching he endured was more than an act of hatred, it was a message, a warning that his ambition, education, and uniform could not shield him from the prejudice woven into the very fabric of the country he was serving. But instead of breaking him, that confrontation with danger forged an even deeper resolve within him. He understood with clarity that the struggle was larger than himself, that the injustice he faced personally was part of a much broader system designed to crush not only individual dreams but entire communities. Houston refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he transformed that trauma into a determination to use his talents where they would be most effective, not on the battlefield with a rifle, but in the courts with the power of the law. Returning home from the war, Houston was no longer the same young man who had marched off with aspirations of honor. He had witnessed firsthand the contradiction of a nation that called men to fight for democracy abroad, while denying them the most basic freedoms at home. That contradiction burned within him and gave his life a renewed sense of direction. He saw the legal system not just as a tool for order, but as a weapon that had been used to enforce inequality. And he vowed to master it so that it could be reshaped into an instrument of justice. It was a profound shift, a recognition that true change would not come from asking for acceptance or waiting for recognition, but from strategically dismantling the barriers that denied equality. What made Houston unique was his ability to connect the personal with the political. The insult he had endured as a black officer was not his burden alone. It was a shared burden that spoke to the condition of millions of others who were trapped in the same cycle of discrimination. By deciding to dedicate his life to the law, he was, in essence, choosing to fight back with intellect, persistence, and strategy rather than with anger or despair. He believed that through careful preparation and unrelenting advocacy, it was possible to chip away at the very foundation of segregation, case, precedent by precedent, until the system itself had no choice but to change. In telling the story of this pivotal moment in Houston's life, it is essential to understand how deeply it influenced every step he took thereafter. That brush with death gave him more than just survival. It gave him a vision. He knew that the legal battles ahead would be long and exhausting, but he also knew that the stakes were too high to ignore. Every barrier torn down in the courtroom would ripple outward, changing lives, inspiring communities, and proving that injustice, no matter how powerful, was not invincible. Houston's resolve became his compass, guiding him toward a life that would leave an indelible mark on history. From that moment on, Houston was no longer content to simply excel academically or to pursue personal success. His ambitions became intertwined with the liberation of his people. The uniform he once wore in war was replaced by the suit and tie of a lawyer, but in his mind, the fight was still for survival, dignity, and freedom. The courtroom became his battlefield, the Constitution his shield, And every case he took on a campaign against the forces that had once threatened to silence him forever. And while the scars of that near lynching never fully left him, they became reminders of why the struggle mattered so deeply, why each step forward was worth every sacrifice. The incident that nearly claimed his life thus became the defining catalyst for the extraordinary career that followed. It transformed his anger into strategy, his pain into purpose, and his survival into service. Rather than shrinking under the weight of hatred, he grew stronger, sharper, more determined to confront the system that had tried to destroy him. Houston would go on to craft a legal vision that shaped the very course of civil rights in America, a vision rooted in the belief that the law could, if wielded with brilliance and persistence, dismantle centuries of oppression. And behind that vision was the memory of a uniformed officer who once faced the abyss of racial violence and chose, with unwavering courage, to turn survival into a mission for justice. When Houston returned from his service, carrying the weight of experiences that most men never had to endure, he found himself caught between two Americas. On one hand, he had defended a nation that proclaimed liberty and justice as its most sacred values, a country that spoke to the world about democracy and freedom. On the other hand, the same nation that demanded his loyalty and sacrifice still denied him dignity when he walked its streets, still forced him to live in a society that measured his worth not by his abilities or courage, but by the color of his skin. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. He had seen the United States stand tall abroad, presenting itself as the guardian of human rights. Yet he had felt firsthand the sting of humiliation when those rights were denied to him at home. It was this painful contrast, the lofty rhetoric of equality on foreign soil versus the grim reality of discrimination in his own land, that began to shape his vision of what true justice should mean. Houston recognized that if America truly intended to live up to the ideals it so proudly proclaimed, then it would have to reckon with its own failures. He knew from his own life that violence could not solve the deep injustices rooted in law and tradition. Picking up a weapon might strike a blow, but it would never dismantle the structures that allowed inequality to persist. The true battlefield, he realized, was not in the trenches of war but in the courts, in the laws that governed society, and in the minds of those who clung to outdated beliefs. If one could bend the law toward justice, then change could be lasting. If one could force the nation to confront its contradictions in the light of its own constitution, then progress would no longer be a dream, but a reality written into the very framework of American life. This understanding did not come overnight. It was born from the countless moments when Houston felt the sharp edge of injustice and yet refused to let it define him. It grew out of the memories of standing in uniform, saluting a flag that promised him freedom while watching neighbors who wore the same uniform be treated as if they were strangers in their own country. The hypocrisy of it all could have broken him, but instead it sharpened his resolve. Where others might have turned to bitterness, Houston turned to purpose. He decided that the best way to honor both himself and the generations who came before him was not to fight with his fists, but to wage a different kind of war. One fought with intellect, strategy, and unshakable conviction. In law, he saw a weapon more powerful than any rifle. It was the one tool that, if wielded carefully, could dismantle centuries of oppression. Laws had been used to justify inequality, to draw lines between citizens, and to legitimize exclusion. Yet those same laws, if reinterpreted, challenged, and reshaped, could become instruments of liberation. Houston believed that if he could train his mind as he had once trained his body for service, if he could learn to master the language of the courts, then he could become a soldier for justice in a way no battlefield could ever allow. It was not an easy path. Choosing the law meant years of study, of patience, of preparing for battles that would not be fought with immediate victory, but with long, grueling persistence. Each case would be a campaign, each legal argument a strategic maneuver, And on the war, where victory could be seen in territory gained, his victories would be measured in quiet shifts, in precedents set, in the slow but undeniable transformation of a nation's conscience. For Houston, this was not a compromise but the truest expression of courage. He was not stepping away from the fight, he was stepping into one of far greater consequence. He carried with him the voices of countless others who had endured the same contradictions. For every soldier who returned from service only to face humiliation at a lunch counter, for every child who sat in a segregated classroom while being told that America was the land of opportunity, for every family who contributed their labor to the nation's prosperity while being denied the simplest recognition of equality, Houston fought. Their stories became part of his own story, and their struggles became the fuel that drove him forward. What made Houston's choice so extraordinary was his ability to see beyond the anger of the moment and focus on the horizon of history. He knew that by choosing law as his weapon, he was choosing the slow path, the harder path, but also the one that would endure. A battle fought with violence could be won or lost in a day, but a battle fought in the courts, through the very language of justice, could transform the lives of generations yet unborn. And so he committed himself to that calling. Each time he entered a courtroom, he carried with him not only the weight of his personal experiences, but also the unspoken hope that America could one day be what it claimed to be. He challenged the hypocrisy of a system that held freedom in one hand and inequality in the other. And he demanded that the nation live up to its own promises. It was not merely a legal struggle, it was a moral one. Through his work, Houston forced America to look in the mirror and see the distance between its ideals and its reality. And in doing so, he transformed his pain into purpose. The contradictions that once threatened to crush him became the very foundation of his strength. By turning away from arms and embracing the law, he proved that the greatest battles are not always fought on the fields of war, but in the pursuit of justice, where victory is not won with force but with truth, persistence, and the unshakable belief that equality is worth every sacrifice. Despite the many barriers erected before him, Charles Hamilton Houston refused to bend beneath the weight of prejudice, and instead he carried himself forward with a discipline and vision that would define the rest of his life. His path led him to Harvard, an institution that was then the pinnacle of American legal education, but not free from the attitudes of exclusion and quiet resistance to men of his background. There, Houston did not simply study law, he mastered it. He immersed himself in the rigor of legal reasoning, absorbing the precision of argument and the discipline of analysis, while others might have settled for survival in such a demanding environment. Houston thrived. He rose to the top of his class, gaining the respect of peers and professors alike. The challenges he faced, though subtle and sometimes overt, only sharpened his sense of purpose. Harvard was not just another academic step for him. It was the proving ground where he began to see how the law could be both a tool of oppression and, in the right hands, a weapon for justice. From Harvard he pressed onward, earning advanced degrees that deepened his command of jurisprudence and gave him an edge over those who underestimated him. The higher he climbed academically, the more clearly he understood the responsibility that came with his success. He was not collecting credentials for personal glory. He was gathering the tools he would need to fight a battle that was larger than himself. He knew that every accolade and every degree represented not just personal triumph, but also a challenge to a system that sought to keep people like him confined to narrow boundaries. His education was his armor, and each step forward was another layer of defense against the injustice he had sworn to dismantle. Houston's journey then extended beyond America's shores. In Europe he found not only academic enrichment, but also a new perspective on the world and on his own nation. In cities and universities across the Atlantic, he experienced a kind of intellectual and social freedom that was often denied to him back home. The European environment, while not perfect, offered him a glimpse of what it meant to be judged more by the content of his mind than by the color of his skin. These years abroad left a profound mark on him, not just in the knowledge he gained from lectures and libraries, but in the realization that racial prejudice was not an immutable law of nature, it was a human construct, one that could be challenged, dismantled, and eventually replaced with something more just. His time in Europe also sharpened his appreciation for the contradictions embedded in the American experiment. The same country that proclaimed liberty and justice had also legalized exclusion and inequality. This hypocrisy was never far from his mind, and in the halls of European institutions he could reflect on it from a distance, seeing more clearly how the promises of democracy could be twisted when left unchecked. Rather than letting bitterness consume him, Houston channeled these realizations into a refined vision for the law. He came to see that the courts were not merely neutral arenas, but stages where the nation's deepest contradictions could be confronted and forced into the open. His studies abroad taught him that the law could be shaped, reinterpreted, and used to demand the nation live up to its own ideals. Yet what truly distinguished Houston was not simply his brilliance, but his ability to blend knowledge with an unshackable sense of mission. Many had walked the halls of Harvard and studied in Europe, but few returned with the determination to transform a nation. He carried with him the belief that change would not come through violence, nor through passive waiting, but through the steady, relentless use of the law as a weapon of progress. His education became the blueprint for his activism, a structure within which he would train others and chart strategies that would one day alter the fabric of American life. In every challenge he embraced, one can see the threads of this larger story. Harvard taught him the discipline of logic, advanced degrees gave him depth, and Europe gave him perspective. Taken together, these experiences forged a man who was no longer content to stand on the sidelines of history. He understood that he had been prepared for a purpose greater than himself. He returned to America not just as a scholar, but as a strategist ready to open the way for generations who would follow. Houston's journey was never easy. It required resilience to thrive in spaces that were not designed for him, humility to learn from those around him, and vision to see beyond the barriers of the present. But he embraced each step with a clarity of purpose that few possessed. His path was proof that education, when coupled with determination, could become a revolutionary force. Through his studies he had sharpened his mind into a precise instrument, ready to cut through the tangled web of laws and precedents that upheld inequality. By the time he completed his education, Houston had not only acquired knowledge, but had transformed himself into a man who understood the stakes of the struggle before him. He had seen what justice might look like abroad, experienced what injustice looked like at home, and he recognized that his role was to bridge that gap with the only weapon he trusted: the law. His story was no longer just about personal achievement. It was about channeling his gifts into a cause that would outlive him. In this way, every late night of study, every lecture attended, and every examination passed became more than academic exercises. They became the building blocks of a strategy that would one day reshape the nation's conscience. Through it all, Houston exemplified the power of intellect harnessed to a moral mission. His education did not distance him from the struggles of his people. It bound him even more tightly to them. He saw clearly that his path through Harvard, his advanced studies, and his time in Europe were not detours from the struggle for justice, but essential preparations for it. In his, each step was another stride toward dismantling the barriers that had for so long stood in the way of equality. And with this preparation, he was ready to return, not as a student, but as a warrior of the law, equipped to challenge a system that had underestimated him and determined to bend it. At last, toward justice. When Charles Hamilton Houston accepted the role of Vice Dean at Howard University's School of Law, he carried with him not only the weight of his own accomplishments, but also the vision of transforming an institution into something far greater than itself. His journey through Harvard, where he excelled despite the obstacles that would have crushed the ambitions of many, and his studies in Europe, where he observed societies wrestling with justice in different ways, had given him both the intellectual tools and the moral clarity to see how education could be wielded as a weapon for equality. At Howard, he saw not just a school but the potential for a training ground where young black men and women could be molded into warriors for justice, armed with the law as their shield and sword. That vision, bold and ambitious, was not about personal glory but about preparing a generation who could challenge, in courtrooms and legislatures, the deeply entrenched systems that denied dignity and opportunity to millions of their people. Howard's law school in the early 20th century was not yet a powerhouse, nor was it seen as a central hub of legal activism. Yet Houston understood that to fight systemic injustice, one needed an army of legal minds, disciplined and fearless, ready to dismantle barriers brick by brick, precedent by precedent. He approached his task with the precision of a military strategist, which is why the nickname the West Point of civil rights became so fitting. At WESP, cadets were trained with rigor, discipline, and a sense of higher duty. At Howard, Houston demanded the same, except his cadets would not march on battlefields with rifles but stand in courtrooms with legal arguments that pierced through centuries of discrimination. Every lecture, every assignment, every moot court was crafted not simply to teach the law, but to prepare students for the larger mission that awaited them beyond the campus gates. His teaching was never abstract. He knew that the students before him, many the first in their families to reach such heights, were standing at the intersection of personal ambition and collective responsibility. He taught them not only case law, but also the stakes of the struggle that a well-prepared lawyer could challenge unjust statutes, defend the voiceless, and set in motion changes that would ripple across generations. Houston's students quickly learned that mediocrity would not be tolerated. He pushed them relentlessly, holding them to standards that often seemed impossibly high, not because he lacked compassion, but because he understood the scale of the challenges they would face once they stepped into a hostile world where every mistake could cost not just a client's freedom, but the credibility of a larger movement. What set Houston apart was his ability to infuse legal education with purpose. He reminded his students that they were not only training for careers but for a cause. At a time when segregation was the law of the land and discrimination seemed immovable, the very act of preparing a cadre of skilled black lawyers was revolutionary. He impressed upon them that they were not to be passive observers of injustice, but active agents in dismantling it. This sense of duty gave Howard's graduates a collective identity that transcended individual ambition. They left the university not just with degrees but with a mission, one that carried the weight of an entire community's hopes. The transformation of Howard into the West Point of civil rights did not happen overnight, nor was it achieved without resistance. Resources were limited. Skepticism abounded, and the broader legal establishment often looked down on Howard. Yet Houston's determination never wavered. He fought to secure funding, brought in faculty who shared his vision, and built a curriculum that emphasized not only technical mastery of the law, but also the moral responsibility to wield it for the greater good. His sharp mind and tireless advocacy attracted some of the brightest students of the era, many of whom would go on to shape landmark cases that redefined American society. Among those students was a young man named Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the architect of the legal campaign that dismantled school segregation, and eventually the first black justice on the United States Supreme Court. Houston saw Marshall's potential early on and pushed him harder than perhaps anyone else, sharpening his legal skills with the same intensity that a military officer sharpens the instincts of a promising cadet. Under Houston's guidance, Marshall and others absorbed not only the technicalities of constitutional law, but also the strategic thinking necessary to wage a long campaign against systemic injustice. Houston's influence extended far beyond the walls of Howard. By shaping the school into a breeding ground for excellence and resistance, He ensured that its graduates carried with them not only knowledge, but also an unshakable sense of duty. The lawyers he trained would go on to argue cases that challenged segregation in housing, education, and employment. Each victory, no matter how small, was a brick removed from the wall of oppression, and each setback was met with the resilience that Houston had instilled in them. The title West Point of Civil Rights was not a casual label. It captured the essence of what Houston built. Just as military academies shape leaders who defend a nation's freedom, Howard under Houston shaped lawyers who defended the freedom of a people. The metaphor was apt because it spoke to the discipline, rigor, and strategy that defined his approach. His students understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a disciplined force bound by shared purpose and guided by a leader whose vision was as uncompromising as it was inspiring. By the time Houston left Howard, the transformation was undeniable. What had once been a modest institution had become the epicenter of a legal revolution. The ripple effects of his leadership reached far beyond Washington, touching communities across the nation where the lawyers he trained brought hope and change. His work at Howard did not merely elevate an institution. It altered the trajectory of a movement, proving that education, when infused with vision and discipline, could become one of the most powerful weapons against injustice. In this way, Houston's legacy at Howard was not just about the students he trained but about the foundation he laid for the broader civil rights struggle. By turning Howard into the West Point of civil rights, he ensured that the battle for justice would not be fought by isolated individuals but by a well-prepared, deeply committed army of legal minds. It was a transformation that combined intellect with purpose, discipline with compassion, and education with revolution, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through every courtroom where his students stood to challenge the status quo. Charles Hamilton Houston's influence extended far beyond the walls of Howard University, and nowhere was this more evident than in his mentorship of a young law student named Thurgood Marshall. When Marshall first walked through the doors of Howard's law school, he was brilliant and determined, but like many young men of his generation, he lacked the refinement and systematic discipline that could turn raw ambition into lasting impact. Houston saw in him a spark that could become a fire, and with careful guidance, he molded Marshall's approach to the law, showing him not only the technical brilliance required to argue before the highest courts, but also the deeper responsibility of wielding the law as a weapon for justice. The relationship between teacher and student became one of the most important partnerships in American legal history, a link in a chain that stretched from the first stirrings of black intellectual resistance in the post-Reconstruction era all the way to the courtroom of the United States Supreme Court. Marshall often described Houston as relentless, a man who demanded excellence because he knew mediocrity could not break centuries of entrenched barriers. Houston's classroom was no ordinary space. It was a training ground where arguments were sharpened like blades and logic was tested against the weight of history. He forced his students to think critically, to anticipate not only the letter of the law but also the unspoken biases and resistance they would face in courtrooms dominated by prejudice. For Marshall, this was transformative. He entered Howard with a passion for justice, but under Houston's tutelage, that passion was refined into a strategy, step-by-step case. Houston showed him how to dismantle the legal framework that upheld systemic inequality, not through fiery speeches alone but through meticulous, undeniable argumentation that left courts with no choice but to recognize the truth. It is impossible to understand Marshall's later triumphs without tracing them back to Houston's influence. When Marshall argued Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, a case that forever changed the trajectory of American education and civil rights, he was carrying forward the blueprint Houston had drawn years earlier. The doctrine of separate but equal had been upheld for decades. Yet Houston had demonstrated through his pioneering work that segregation could never truly be equal. He had taught his students to expose the deep flaws in that doctrine, to show through evidence, logic, and lived experience that separation was itself an instrument of inequality. Marshall took those lessons with him into the courtroom, and in doing so, he was not only arguing his own case but also extending Huston's vision into reality. Their bond also reveals something profound about the way change is made. Huston knew his health was fragile, and that his time to personally argue every battle was limited. Yet instead of despairing, he invested his energy in preparing others, recognizing that a movement survives not because of one person's brilliance, but because that brilliance is passed on, multiplied, and adapted by the next generation. Marshall was his most famous protégé, but countless others carried pieces of Huston's philosophy with them into legal practice, politics, and community leadership. It was a deliberate act of legacy building, a recognition that true transformation requires an army of prepared minds, not a single hero standing alone. Marshall, for his part, never forgot what Huston had given him. Throughout his career, even as he rose to the highest legal office in the nation, he spoke of Huston with reverence, describing him as the architect of the movement. He understood that while he may have been the one to stand before the Supreme Court, it was Huston who had laid the foundation that made victory possible. Their partnership illustrates the power of mentorship not as a passive relationship, but as an active shaping of destiny. Huston demanded that Marshall think bigger than one case or one courtroom, that he imagine how the law could be wielded to reshape the very structure of American society. The story of Huston and Marshall is also the story of persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. They were not merely fighting legal technicalities. They were challenging centuries-old structures designed to preserve inequality. Each case they took on was a step toward a future most people around them could not yet see. But Huston believed in the power of law as a living force, capable of bending toward justice if wielded with enough courage and skill. Marshall inherited that belief and carried it with him, proving that one generation's vision could become the next generation's achievement. When Marshall finally took his seat on the Supreme Court, becoming the first black justice in American history, it was more than a personal triumph. It was the culmination of Huston's philosophy, embodied in one of his brightest students, the teacher who had once paced the halls of Howard University, urging his students to prepare for battles larger than themselves, had lived long enough to plant seeds that would blossom decades later in the very heart of the American legal system. Marshall's presence on the court was a silent tribute to Huston's work, proof that even in the face of enormous resistance, the careful cultivation of talent and vision could change a nation. In this way, the story of Huston guiding Marshall is not only about two men, but about the continuity of struggle, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next, and the belief that law, when wielded with clarity and determination, can become a force for liberation. It reminds us that progress is rarely the result of sudden miracles, but rather the outcome of patient, deliberate preparation, where each victory builds upon the lessons of those who came before. Marshall stood as the visible figure of triumph, but behind him was Huston, the strategist, the mentor, and the architect who had taught him how to turn ideals into legal reality. Their partnership remains one of the most compelling stories of transformation through education, vision, and unwavering commitment to justice. As special counsel, Huston designed lawsuits that chipped away at separate but equal, documenting unequal conditions across the South. But the story of how he went about this is as much about perseverance as it is about legal skill. Because the courts of the 1930s and 1940s were not friendly places for those who sought to challenge the established order, and every step required courage, patience, and a strategic vision that went beyond individual cases. He knew that one lawsuit alone could not topple a doctrine that had been enshrined for decades, since the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision. So he began with the painstaking work of showing that what the law called separate was in practice anything but equal. In schools across the South, black children sat in overcrowded classrooms with crumbling walls, worn textbooks, and no proper facilities, while their white counterparts enjoyed bright, well-equipped buildings with every possible advantage. Houston realized that photographs, statistics, and on-the-ground reports could expose these disparities in a way that judges could not ignore. And so he dispatched teams to collect evidence that told the unvarnished truth. The cases he crafted were not always designed to win outright, but to lay groundwork, to create a paper trail of undeniable facts that built pressure and momentum over time. Because he understood that legal revolutions are not sudden thunderstorms but long seasons of rain that gradually soak the soil until change becomes inevitable. With each lawsuit, he chose plaintiffs carefully, often selecting children or families whose circumstances illustrated the injustice with heartbreaking clarity. He presented judges with evidence so overwhelming that even those inclined to defend segregation were forced to acknowledge its cracks. By showing that resources allocated to black schools were a fraction of what white schools received, Houston challenged the states to uphold their own claims of equality, forcing them into an impossible position: either admit that separate but equal was a hollow phrase or commit far more resources than they were willing to spend. What made his strategy remarkable was not just the cases themselves, but the discipline with which he built them into a coherent campaign. He viewed the courtroom as a battlefield where each victory, no matter how small, became part of a larger offensive. He was also a teacher, guiding a generation of young lawyers, among them Thurgood Marshall, who absorbed both his tactical brilliance and his belief that law could be wielded as a weapon for justice. In this way, Houston's influence spread far beyond the pages of court transcripts, because he was building not just a body of cases, but a movement armed with knowledge and determination. There is something almost cinematic about the image of Houston hunched over stacks of documents late into the night, poring over budgets, enrollment figures, and facility reports, knowing that these dry numbers could serve as ammunition in a war of ideas. He taught his colleagues that every cracked wall, every missing desk, every outdated book was not merely an inconvenience but evidence of a system designed to deny dignity, and by framing these facts in legal arguments, he transformed the lived experiences of countless families into a case that the highest courts would one day have to confront. His work was often grueling, requiring travel across hostile territories where he faced intimidation, yet he pressed on, convinced that truth presented with precision could outlast threats and prejudice. Even those who opposed him sometimes admitted a grudging respect for his meticulous preparation. He entered courtrooms where the odds were stacked against him, where entire communities resisted the very idea of equality, and yet he kept his composure, laying out facts in a calm and steady voice that made it harder to dismiss his arguments as mere rhetoric. He believed that the law could be forced to live up to its own ideals if pushed with enough evidence and persistence. That belief became the heartbeat of his career, giving him the resilience to face setbacks without losing sight of the ultimate goal. What emerged from Houston's years of work was a body of precedent that slowly eroded the foundations of segregation. Case, motion by motion. It was never fast, never easy, but it was relentless. And by the time the nation reached the landmark decision of Brown v. Board of Education, the ground had been prepared by Houston's relentless pursuit of proof that inequality was not hypothetical but measurable, visible, and undeniable. The brilliance of his vision lay in his ability to connect the struggles of individual children in dusty classrooms to the broader principles enshrined in the Constitution, making it clear that the promise of equal protection under the law could no longer coexist with the daily reality of segregation. His story is a reminder that change often comes not from one dramatic moment but from years of determined effort, carried forward by those willing to do the painstaking work of assembling facts and building arguments until the weight of truth becomes too heavy to ignore. Houston may not have lived to see the full victory of his strategy, But his fingerprints were on every milestone along the path toward dismantling legalized segregation. Through his lawsuits, he redefined the role of a lawyer from a mere advocate for clients to an architect of social transformation, showing how the courtroom could become a stage where the fight for justice was waged one exhibit at a time. In the end, what he accomplished was more than a series of legal victories. It was the reshaping of a national conscience, proving that when evidence is marshaled with purpose and conviction, even the most entrenched systems can be compelled to yield. His meticulous battles against separate but equal were not just about education, but about dignity, citizenship, and the idea that no child should grow up believing their future is predetermined by the color of their skin. That legacy continues to resonate, reminding us that courage combined with strategy has the power to change the course of history. In the years when Charles Hamilton Houston was meticulously shaping the legal battlefield, his approach was never reckless, never left to chance, but calculated with the precision of a master strategist who understood that dismantling injustice would require more than fiery rhetoric or raw courage. He knew that the system could not be toppled in one sweeping gesture, but rather chipped away case by case, precedent by precedent, until the very pillars of inequality began to crack under the weight of undeniable truth. It was in this spirit that Houston guided a series of landmark cases, each one a deliberate step forward, each one carefully chosen to reveal the contradictions and hypocrisies within the doctrine of separate but equal. One of his most brilliant moves came in the case of Missouri ex rel. Gaines v. Canada in 1938, a decision that would send ripples far beyond the state of Missouri and announce that the battle for educational equality was not a dream for the distant future, but a demand for the present moment. The story of Lloyd Gaines, the young black man at the center of the case, was emblematic of the quiet yet powerful defiance that Houston sought to channel. Gaines applied to the University of Missouri Law School, the only publicly funded law school in the state, and was denied admission solely on account of his race. The state attempted to dodge responsibility by offering to pay his tuition at an out-of-state institution, but Houston saw this for what it was: a cynical attempt to maintain segregation while avoiding direct confrontation with its obvious inequalities. If Missouri truly offered equal protection, Houston argued, then it must provide Gaines with the same opportunity for education within its own borders. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling that the state could not sidestep its constitutional obligations by outsourcing its responsibilities. In securing this victory, Houston had not only won a place for Gaines, but had also cracked open the door to challenge the broader system of exclusion that denied countless others the chance to pursue their dreams. What made Houston's approach so remarkable was the way he layered each case upon the last, building a foundation that could withstand scrutiny and could not be easily dismissed as isolated victories. Missouri v. Gaines was not just about one man's right to attend law school. It was about exposing the very weakness of segregationist logic. Once the Supreme Court declared that Gaines must be admitted because no equal facility existed in the state, Houston and his colleagues had a powerful precedent to argue in future cases. They could now demonstrate, time and again, that separate facilities were inherently unequal, and that the promise of equal opportunity could never truly be fulfilled as long as segregation persisted. This was the strategy that later came to fruition in cases like Sweat v. Painter in 1950, where Houston's intellectual heir, Thurgood Marshall, argued successfully that the hastily created black law school in Texas was no match in quality, reputation, or resources to the University of Texas Law School. The court recognized that intangible factors like faculty reputation, networking opportunities, and access to professional connections mattered just as much as physical buildings, making true equality impossible under segregation. The echoes of Houston's vision also resounded in McLaurin v. Oklahoma, decided in the same year, where the court struck down the humiliating restrictions placed on George McLaurin, An older black student admitted to the University of Oklahoma's doctoral program but forced to sit apart from his white peers in classrooms, libraries, and cafeterias. Houston's careful groundwork had made these victories possible because he had trained his students, prepared the arguments, and insisted on a vision of equality that went beyond surface appearances. He taught them to see the law not as an immovable obstacle, but as a tool that could be wielded with precision to carve out a better future. Each of these cases was more than just a legal battle. They were chapters in a larger narrative that Houston had been writing with every choice, every argument, and every mentor-student conversation. He had once told his proteges that a lawyer was either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And through these battles, he proved what he meant. He was not merely trying to win for the sake of winning. He was trying to engineer a transformation so profound that future generations would no longer know the barriers that his own had faced. Missouri v. Gaines had shown that states could not simply export their problems. Sweat v. Painter had shown that equality could not be measured solely in bricks and mortar. McLaurin v. Oklahoma had shown that dignity and full participation mattered as much as physical presence. Together, these cases formed a chain of logic that would eventually culminate in the most famous case of all, Brown v. Board of Education. But long before Brown was decided, Houston's fingerprints were already visible on every page of this evolving story. Even when his health began to falter, and he would not live to see the crowning victories that his students achieved, the path had been laid, and the seeds he planted had taken root. What made his work resonate so deeply was not only the legal precedents he set, but the way he infused his mission with humanity. Every name in the casebooks represented a real person with real aspirations, and Houston never lost sight of that. Gaines wanted to be a lawyer. Sweat wanted the prestige and training that only the University of Texas could provide. McLaurin sought the dignity of equal treatment. By fighting for their rights, Houston was fighting for the dignity of all who had been relegated to the margins by an unjust system. As the story unfolded, it became clear that Houston's strategy was as much about storytelling as it was about law. He understood that in order to persuade judges, lawmakers, and even the broader public, one had to frame each case not as an abstract legal question, but as a story of individuals denied their rightful place in the world. In this way, each victory became a moral lesson as well as a legal one, showing the country not only what the Constitution required, but also what justice demanded. His victories were not just steps toward legal equality. They were steps toward reshaping the nation's conscience, compelling people to reckon with the contradiction between America's ideals and its realities. In weaving together these stories, Houston did more than win cases. He constructed a roadmap for change. Each case was a stone laid carefully on a long path that stretched toward a horizon he would not personally reach, but that he knew others would continue to walk. His brilliance lay not only in the victories themselves, but in the way he taught others to carry forward the fight, ensuring that the torch would never be extinguished. In this sense, Houston's legacy was not merely in the law books, but in the generations of lawyers, activists, and ordinary people who found courage and inspiration in his example. By the time Brown v. Board came to challenge the very heart of separate but equal, the arguments were already waiting, sharpened by years of careful preparation. Because Houston had seen this day coming long before the rest of the world believed it possible, and in that foresight, in that tireless dedication, lies the enduring power of his story. Charles Hamilton Houston understood something that many legal minds of his generation overlooked, and it was this vision that set him apart as an architect of change. He knew that winning in the courtroom was only one part of the battle, because the law, no matter how eloquently written or argued, could not on its own reshape the hearts and minds of an entire society. What mattered just as much was how those victories resonated beyond the courthouse walls, how they reached into communities, how they stirred public opinion, and how they gave people a sense that change was possible and within reach. For Houston, each legal case was not only a chance to challenge discrimination in its immediate form but also a tool to build momentum, to inspire ordinary citizens to believe in their right to dignity, and to encourage communities to see themselves as active participants in dismantling the barriers around them. He had lived long enough to know that laws could sit on paper without altering daily life, unless people themselves pushed to make those laws real. And so he worked tirelessly to connect the courtroom to the community in ways that made the legal struggle a shared endeavor rather than a distant intellectual exercise. His approach was not accidental, nor was it simply born of abstract theory. Houston drew this understanding from his own experiences, from what he had seen growing up, from his service in World War I, where he witnessed both the promise of democracy and its contradictions, and from his time as a lawyer traveling through towns where ordinary men and women faced constant challenges under a system that denied them fairness. He recognized that if victories like Gaines v. Canada or Sweat Painter were to carry their full weight, people had to know about them, believe in them, and use them as leverage for further demands. This is why he often framed legal progress as part of a larger story. A story that did not belong to judges or lawyers alone, but to communities who had suffered and endured for generations. He believed that if you gave people a narrative that connected their daily struggles to the broader arc of justice, they would rally around it, support it, and carry it forward with strength that no legal argument alone could muster. Houston, in effect, became not only a lawyer but also a strategist of persuasion, someone who thought as deeply about how to shape collective consciousness as he did about how to shape a brief before the Supreme Court. One of the most remarkable aspects of his strategy was his insistence that education and communication were themselves weapons in the struggle. Houston often traveled with students, teaching them not just the letter of the law, but also the importance of outreach. He encouraged them to speak in churches, to meet with community leaders, to explain why a legal case in a distant city mattered to families in their own neighborhoods. In doing, he was creating a generation of lawyer activists who understood that their role was not limited to presenting arguments before judges, but extended into the very fabric of social life. He knew that people needed to feel ownership of the movement, and by bringing the courtroom into the public square, he ensured that victories would not be isolated events but turning points with ripple effects. Each success in court became a beacon of hope, and each story of resistance gained power when retold in communities hungry for signs of progress. This kind of grassroots connection gave the legal campaign its durability and its soul. The importance of public opinion was never far from Houston's mind. He studied history closely and understood how deeply entrenched systems of inequality had always been defended not just by laws but also by cultural attitudes. To truly dismantle these systems, he realized, one needed to chip away at both. A court ruling could prohibit a university from denying admission based on race, but it could not on its own erase the prejudice of those who clung to old ways. Yet, by aligning legal victories with organized community mobilization, Houston was planting seeds of change in multiple directions. Judges could be swayed by precedent, while ordinary citizens could be emboldened by stories of triumph. Together, these forces created a cycle where public support reinforced legal authority, and legal authority in turn validated public courage. The genius of Houston's strategy lay in this interplay, in his ability to see that law and society were not separate spheres but reflections of one another, constantly influencing and reshaping in response to the other. Houston also understood the psychological power of collective action. When a community saw one of their own succeed in court, it was not just the individual who won, it was everyone who had ever felt the sting of exclusion. He wanted people to see themselves in those victories, to walk taller because a door had been opened, to speak louder because silence was no longer their only option. He knew that hope was contagious, and that once people began to believe in the possibility of change, they would demand more, fight harder, and refused to accept the status quo. It was this momentum, born of countless small acts of courage, that could transform local triumphs into national turning points. In this way, Houston's insistence on linking legal success with community mobilization was not only practical but visionary, because he saw the long road ahead and knew that only a movement rooted in both law and public will could sustain itself against the weight of entrenched opposition. Over time, this philosophy would inspire the larger civil rights movement, where leaders like Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless unnamed activists carried forward the lesson that the struggle was as much about mobilizing people as it was about persuading judges. Houston's insistence on building bridges between the courtroom and the community provided the framework for marches, sit-ins, and grassroots campaigns that would later shake the foundations of segregation. His work proved that when the law speaks and the people answer, the combination becomes an unstoppable force. Every case he fought, every strategy he designed, was a piece of a larger mosaic, one that told the story of not just legal triumph but human resilience. And it was this story, built on both words and deeds, that ultimately set the stage for some of the most transformative victories in the quest for justice. Charles Hamilton Houston's life was one defined by sacrifice, vision, and an unshakable belief that the law could be used as a tool for justice in a society that had been built on deep inequalities. He was a man who rarely paused, who saw time not as a luxury but as a resource to be spent urgently, carefully, and with purpose. Day after day, he poured every ounce of energy into crafting legal strategies that could chip away at the foundation of segregation. The world often saw him as a man of immense discipline and determination, someone whose sharp mind and rigorous preparation left no room for error in the courtroom. But beneath that brilliance there was also a cost. Working relentlessly, often through sleepless nights and endless days, Houston pushed himself to the edge, and in doing so he sacrificed his health for a vision of a more equal America. By the time his body finally gave in, he had left behind a blueprint for victory that others would one day carry forward. Houston's passing in 1950 came just 4 years before one of the most historic moments in American legal history, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Though he was not there to witness it, his fingerprints were all over that triumph. Every argument made, every precedent cited, and every strategy employed in that case had its roots in the years he had spent developing a legal foundation to dismantle segregation. The victory in Brown was not an overnight success, nor was it simply the result of one case. It was the culmination of decades of painstaking preparation. And much of that work had been carried on the back of Houston's vision. In a very real sense, he had given his life to a cause that was larger than himself, and though he was not alive to celebrate, his influence echoed through the courtroom on that day when the justices finally declared that segregation in public education was unconstitutional. The story of Houston's final years reveals just how much he poured into the struggle. He knew he was fighting against an entrenched system that would not fall easily, and that meant his work had to be meticulous. His students often recalled how demanding he was, how he pushed them to think not just like lawyers but like architects, building structures of argument that could withstand the harshest scrutiny. That rigor came at a price. Long hours spent studying case law, drafting briefs, and training the next generation of legal minds drained his strength. But he refused to slow down. He saw the movement as a relay race, and his responsibility was to run his leg with everything he had, no matter what toll it took on him personally. When he died at just 54, the loss was felt deeply within the civil rights community. Thurgood Marshall, his protege and later the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, was among those who carried Houston's teachings into battle. Marshall himself would say that without Houston, there would have been no Brown decision. This was not an exaggeration, but a recognition of the foundation Houston had laid, brick by brick, case precedent by precedent. His life was a reminder that change rarely comes from a single dramatic moment but from years of quiet, determined effort, often unseen and uncelebrated until much later. Houston's absence at the moment of victory adds a certain poignancy to his story. One can imagine the bittersweet feelings of those who knew him well when the ruling was announced in 1954. They must have thought of the countless nights he had spent hunched over legal texts, the relentless way he pursued every possible path to weaken the doctrine of separate but equal. They must have remembered his stern but encouraging voice, pushing them harder than they thought they could go, demanding excellence because the stakes were so high. For them, the Brown decision was not just a legal milestone but a testament to Houston's life and legacy. It was proof that his sacrifices had not been in vain, that the years he spent wearing down his own body in pursuit of justice had yielded something that would change the nation forever. The broader story of Houston's death and the victory that followed is also a reminder of the intergenerational nature of progress. Houston understood that he might not live to see the fruits of his labor, and yet he worked with the same intensity, as if the finish line were right in front of him. He planted seeds knowing others would harvest them, and in doing so he became a bridge between eras. His determination ensured that when the moment for change finally arrived, the legal foundation was strong enough to support it. Without him, the case might have collapsed under the weight of weak arguments or shaky precedents. With him, it stood tall, strong enough to overturn one of the most deeply entrenched injustices in American society. Houston's passing in 1950 reminds us of the sacrifices demanded by great causes, but it also shows the power of vision. He may not have been alive to hear the words of the Supreme Court in 1954, but the decision carried his spirit within it. Every child who walked through the doors of a newly desegregated school, every family who saw the promise of equality inch closer to reality, was in some way touched by his work. His story illustrates that legacies are not always about what we witness personally but about what we set in motion for others to continue. In the end, Houston's life was both a warning about the costs of unrelenting struggle and a celebration of what can be achieved when one dedicates themselves fully to justice. Though his health failed him, his ideas did not. Though his body could not endure the endless grind, his strategies survived to achieve what he had dreamed of. And though he could not sit in the courtroom to see the victory, his presence was undeniable in every word of the ruling. Charles Hamilton Houston died in 1950, but his vision lived on, and 4 years later the world bore witness to the power of his labor, as a nation took its first real step toward dismantling the walls of segregation that had divided it for so long. In the end, the life and legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston remind us that history is not only shaped by presidents, generals, or well-known leaders, but also by individuals who work tirelessly behind the scenes, pouring their energy, intellect, and vision into creating change that benefits millions. Houston, often called the man who killed Jim Crow, was not a man of loud speeches or sweeping theatrics. Instead, he waged his battles in courtrooms, in libraries, and in classrooms, proving that the law itself could be bent toward justice if wielded with precision and courage. His work showed that injustice could be dismantled not only by protest in the streets, but also by persistence in the halls of law, where the foundations of society's rules are written and contested. What makes Houston's journey so extraordinary is not just the legal victories he helped inspire, but the way he redefined the very role of the lawyer in America. He refused to see the law as a neutral system. He understood it as a living force, one that could be turned into an engine for transformation. For him, every statute and precedent carried consequences for human lives, and every argument made in court had the potential to shape the path of generations. He cultivated this belief among his students, most notably Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first black Supreme Court justice. In that, Houston was not only a fighter but also a mentor, planting seeds that would grow into one of the most important legal movements in history. And yet, his brilliance came with sacrifice. He worked so relentlessly, so passionately, that he ultimately paid the highest price: his health. Dying in 1950, he never saw the fruits of the Brown v. Board of Education decision just 4 years later, the landmark ruling that declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Still, his handprints were all over that decision, and his vision ran like a thread through every argument, every page, and every verdict that dismantled Jim Crow's legal scaffolding, even though he was not physically there to celebrate. His spirit, his strategies, and his teachings guided those who stood in court and made history. His story is also a lesson about the unseen battles that shape progress. While many people recognize the names of leaders who stand at podiums or march in front of cameras, it is often the quiet, unseen labor, the sleepless nights, the tireless research, the carefully constructed arguments that lays the groundwork for change. Houston's life reminds us that true revolution is not always loud. Sometimes, it is methodical, thoughtful, and deeply rooted in patience and persistence. It is the kind of revolution that does not demand immediate recognition but seeks lasting impact. When we reflect on Houston's work, it becomes clear that the fight for justice is never finished. Each generation must decide whether to carry forward the torch or let it dim. His example challenges us to ask ourselves, what are we doing, in our own ways, to bend the arc of history toward fairness? We may not all be lawyers standing in front of the Supreme Court, but each of us holds power in our voices, in our action, in our insistence on dignity for every person. If Houston could turn the rigid structures of law into tools of liberation, then we, too, can find ways, small or large, to confront injustice in our daily lives. In remembering him, we honor not only one man but also the countless others whose names may never be widely known, but who labor with the same passion for a more equitable world. Change is not built overnight, and progress is rarely the result of one moment. It is the accumulation of countless steps, countless sacrifices, and countless hands pushing together in the same direction. Houston's life shows us that the law, often perceived as cold or rigid, can in fact be a living force for good when guided by compassion, intelligence, and courage. As we close this story tonight, let us carry with us the inspiration of Charles Hamilton Houston, the reminder that justice requires dedication, that progress requires patience, and that even the quietest battles can shape the loudest victories. He proved, once and for all, that the pen and the law book could be as powerful as any protest or speech, and that a single life devoted to truth can shift the destiny of a nation. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey into history. If you found this story meaningful, please do not forget to like this video, share it with others who care about justice, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring stories that shape our understanding of the past and guide us in the present. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more of these important narratives to light.